know today's House of Representatives are very young, as this class is, but I can say not many, it'd be a fair assumption to say not many have kids. However, it's not a fair assumption I'd say almost all of you are planning to have kids. I think it'd be another fair assumption to say you guys would not trust someone with your kids on parole. I think another fair assumption to say you guys would not trust someone who's on parole for child molestation. Today I want to talk about how child molesters will repeat again. I want to talk about the repeat rape cases, how they repeat child molestation, also other times as well, not just child molestation, the economic costs, and why good behavior in prison to get out early simply is not enough. I will give you these sources with previous Supreme Court cases. I will also give you peer-reviewed journals and use logic that I learned from introductory philosophy classes from Sacramento State University, an accredited four-year college in Sacramento. Now, child molesters will commit crimes again after being released. A Supreme Court case, Godfrey versus Doe, said that rapists, upon release, 63% of them will commit another crime, and child molesters, up to 72%. And with the rapists that are released, 40% of them will rape again. However, the child molesters who molest young male victims, 40% of them will molest again. Now, it's a very fair argument to say that if we keep people in prison longer, they will not be able to molest since they're in prison. They will not be able to molest young people at least, because you have to be at least 18 to be in prison. Now, another fair argument to say, to keep these children safer who are young, we imprison the dangerous people. Now I want to move on to the cost benefits. Prison is obviously more expensive than parole. Put someone in prison costs $70,000 a year per prisoner. Parole, roughly $1,500. However, according to a study from the New York Times, 36% of women who are in prison were sexually assaulted as a child. This is not to say that if you get sexually assaulted, you're going to go to prison. If you're a victim of sexual assault, you go to prison. That's not what I'm saying. However, it can't just be correlation that if you're a victim, it just so happens that just randomly you'll become a criminal. Causation has to be found somewhere here that the number is far too high to say that sexual assault does not cause women to have mental issues farther in life. Now I want to transition. Some of you say that prisoners aren't entitled to civil rights, that they say good behavior needs to be a deterrent to release. However, from the Journal of Behavioral Science, 52% of people who are released from sexual molestation crimes, only 50% of them are not sexually dangerous, which means almost half of the people released from sexual crimes are still a danger to our children and our societies. It is a far point to say that we can't have sexually dangerous people with our children, not alone just our children with just normal citizens trying to live their daily lives. It is also fair to say if they are in prison, they will not be able to attack people like us, and also be able to attack our current children and future children. Today, I've talked to you about safety of our children, safety of how people will repeat crimes again. I've also thrown away the argument that keeping people in prison costs more money, because of how many more women are in prison in the long run. And I finished with civil rights issues. Now I'll transition to more child safety. If what I said was enough, there's far deeper physical and mental issues that involve our children. I'll transition to Chris Young, who is currently the only man in the room with a blazer. Take away, Chris.
My mom was a victim of child sexual abuse, and it was her grandfather that did it. When she came forward to tell her family, no one believed her, and it wasn't until he died years later when two of my aunts came forward and found out he'd been doing it to them too. I don't say this to separate myself or my mother from anyone. I say it to emphasize how widespread and how common this very real issue is. Mary Finley and Mark Rosenberg wrote a book called Violence in America, and they found that 1/3 of young girls would be sexually abused and almost 10% of young boys. Now that's a staggering staggering statistic, and that's terrifying. But what scares me more is that if we don't do something to increase the punishment for child sexual offenders, then we could potentially see 10% of our sons become victims of this problem, and 30% of our daughters. Now, I'm not going to find anyone in this classroom that thinks that child sexual abuse is a good thing, and I know that a lot of you probably know a lot of the harmful effects of child sexual abuse. It was not difficult for me to come up with an extremely long list, fully cited from 100 different sources, but for the sake of staying within my 4-minute time period, I'm going to abbreviate a bit. This boils down to two things: the immediate effects and long-term effects. The immediate effects are felt within a few months to a few years of the actual incident itself. The Journal of Pediatrics found that victims were 3 times more likely to experience sexual behavior problems, and that can be anything from increased promiscuity at a younger age to inappropriate sexual behavior as young as 6, 7. The Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect found that victims showed poor school performance across the board, and that could be anything from decreased attention span, decreased retention abilities, decreased attendance, and a lot of these students would eventually drop out. The Journal of Research in Crime and Delinquency found that up to 3 to 5 times, victims are 3 to 5 times more likely to be found to be delinquent, and it would lead to arrests later on in their life, as my partner already brought up. And the long-term effects are much more dramatic, although they're not felt until many, many years later when the child is already an adult. The Journal of Traumatic Stress found that women are twice as likely to commit suicide if they're victimized. And the Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect found that men who were abused, 70% of them were treated for suicidal tendencies. That same journal found that women are twice as likely to suffer depression if they're victims. And the Archives of General Psychiatry found that they're 3 times more likely to develop any number of psychiatric disorders, and the list, which includes all of them they can develop, is a mile long. Now, it's not just mental and emotional problems, they're very physical as well. The Journal of Child Abuse and Neglect found that women are twice as likely to become obese later in life because of self-image issues if they were victimized as a kid. And the Journal of Health Psychology found that there are things that we don't even think of that are correlated with it. Diabetes, heart pressure, stroke, cancer, hypertension, they are all increased by up to 40% just by being a victim of child sexual abuse. There's a lot of factors, long-term, short-term, physical, mental, emotional, that can be associated with this, and it's a much bigger problem than it should be. What I'm scared of is that we don't do something about it, it might affect our sons and daughters.
Good afternoon, guys. Thank you. The topic I'm talking about is child molesting, but what I am talking about is the effects it has on your home and your neighborhood. It affects the worth of the home. It affects the surrounding neighborhood that you live in, and it also affects, if you ever sell the home, the price of the market that's going to look at that home. I looked through a variety of sources. Some were liberal, some were conservative. But I looked at certain studies that aimed at 3 different states. One was Ohio, one was Florida, and one was Ohio, and one was Virginia. Now, let me ask you guys, do you know what home equity is? What you guys built off of? So home equity is the current value you have of your house without outstanding mortgages. So what your house is worth regardless of if you have an outstanding mortgage on there. Now, through the studies, they found that if you control variables like neighborhood problems or housing problems, you control all that stuff into one sum. If you have a sex offender that lives next to you, your house value goes down 2.3%. Regardless if it's a beautiful house, 2.3% goes down. So for example, I drew this little map. I know it's a little confusing, but if your house is right next to them, 0.1 miles away, the chances of your house being sold is very unlikely. And if it goes to 0.2 or even 0.3, the problem is regardless of where you live on this place, it's going to affect you. the worst. Lost myself. Okay. The downside about this is that regardless of how you change these factors, it is still going to affect you. It reaches to my second point. So, if you, for example, is trying to sell your house, and you put the house into a beautiful area, you changed everything about that. Now, you let the person that's selling your house that you have a sex offender in there. The chances of that house selling is very unlikely of you actually going to Major League Baseball and winning the winning the World Series. The problem is that depending on where the location of this house is, the likelihood of that house is going to sell is very unlikely. It will last a lot longer on the market than anything else. Sex offenders resident at 0.1 miles, right in this area, reduces the price by approximately 7%. Long term, about close to 80%. So the downside about this is where the location is going to affect it completely. And the last point I'm talking about is what the sex offender is going to do on damage-wise to the neighborhood itself. Now, there is websites that'll show you where the sex offender is located. The downside about that is all it's going to do is put fear into you. The problem is how close you are with your neighborhood, and knowing that there's a sex offender nearby will cause problems, violence, a variety of different problems onto that. So any way you do it, any way you change your house, anyway, it's going to affect it with that sex offender in there. So that's why I'm in favor of having more of a maximum term on sex offenders. Thank you, guys.